So I think starting off, as it's so much in the press at the moment, so we have the press regulation rows, phone hacking trials, and we have legal aid and barristers threatening strike in law. So I mean, do you think that the future is as gloomy as it seems?
I'm very concerned about the future of legal services in this country. I think the criminal bar is at serious risk if the government goes ahead with its proposals. And if the criminal bar is at risk, you're going to get fewer trainees, you're going to get fewer people qualifying as criminal lawyers, and it's going to be harder to recruit criminal judges in the future. And if you don't have judges with experience of criminal law, then the criminal law will get into difficulties. This is a long-term thing, but it's a matter of great concern that young lawyers, perhaps people without family money and means, are going to find it much harder to join the legal profession in areas which used to be open to bright young law students with no family money.
And in terms of the press regulation, I mean, obviously no one wants to sign up to the new proposed charter. So where can the future go? I mean, if you had to give advice, what would you advise?
There's no obligation on the press to sign up to the government's proposals. And indeed, it looks as if it'll be a year or two before there's any obligation at all. If nobody accepts the proposals put forward by the government with the support of the other parties, then it doesn't look as if anything very much is going to happen. The press is going to put forward its own proposals for a regulator, and if they sign up to that, then it's a matter for a future government to decide whether they are willing to accept the regulatory structure proposed by a number of the newspapers. But newspapers have never been regulated in the way that is currently proposed, and it's not surprising that with newspapers desperately trying to hang on to their circulations, in some cases fighting for their very existence, that they are concerned about anything that is going to limit what they see as their ability to report the truth.
I mean, so again, you've worked for all three. You've done broadcast, you've done radio, you've done newspaper. Which did you find the most interesting for your career? And I think, what is the future? Obviously, newspapers are in decline in their circulation. So which news outlet, I guess, is the one that will survive, do you think?
Well, the internet is the news outlet that brings together the two you've mentioned, television and newspapers, and they are being synthesized in this medium that will carry broadcast type news, television pictures, and written stories of the sort we used to read in newspapers. And so the different forms of journalism are converging. You ask which I enjoyed. I enjoy the immediacy of broadcasting, the ability to come out of court and almost instantly report what has been said in court. I also enjoy the opportunity to sit down and read a document and think about it and craft something that can be read at greater leisure.
Again, it leads on to another question I was going to ask you about cameras in courts. So a lot of people have celebrated it and said it's brilliant for access to understanding what goes on within the court system. But then there are those who've said that it could hamper access to justice and right to privacy and maybe even to a fair trial. Do you think that it might become very glamorised and sensationalist like America, or do you think Britain will keep it under control?
I don't think there is a problem of the sort that we've seen in the United States, and that's because there are very strict rules surrounding broadcasting here in England and Wales. To begin with, it's only the Court of Appeal, criminal and civil, that can be shown on television. Secondly, the judge has control over what's recorded and therefore what's available for broadcast. So it's very limited at the moment. But the crucial difference is that we, in this jurisdiction, have rules about contempt of court, we have reporting restrictions, we don't allow people to comment on pending cases, particularly criminal cases. When I went to see the O.J. Simpson case in the United States, in Los Angeles, this was a very famous footballer on trial accused of murdering his wife and a friend. Every day there were commentators saying who had won the day's arguments, just like a football match or a cricket match. Who had scored a point, who had won over the jury. There was comment on a court case just as if it was a sporting event. We don't have that here. We won't have that here, even if televising the courts is extended.
So obviously you qualified as a lawyer. All of that proves that you know exactly what you're talking about. But what was it that, personally I find it interesting because I did a law degree. So what was it that made you think, I don't want to practice the law, I want to report on the law?
It was purely chance. Journalism is often being in the right place at the right time. And I was a trainee solicitor. I was working for a law firm. I'd done the exams. I was spending time as an apprentice, what was called an articled clerk in those days. And somebody mentioned to me that there was a training scheme available at the BBC for would-be journalists. And I applied really just on a whim. I thought it sounded rather good. It said, candidates will be required to take a voice test, which sounded rather glamorous. I applied, and there was a very, very shrewd man, former newspaper journalist, who was looking after the course. And he thought maybe it might be useful for the BBC to have somebody on its staff, trained as a journalist, with legal background. I'd done a law degree, as you say, and I was training to be a lawyer. And although this course was very heavily oversubscribed, I did in fact get a place on the course, and I stayed at the BBC for 25 years.
I think I read somewhere that you are concerned that there's now less and less legally trained legal advisors for newspapers, broadcast, everywhere. And why do you think that is? Do you think it's because people have lost an interest in the law?
There are certainly fewer legal journalists working for newspapers. When I started, the main broadsheet newspapers all had legal correspondents, and some of them don't now. There was a time after I left the BBC and before Clive Coleman became their legal correspondent when they didn't have a full-time legal correspondent. It's sometimes difficult to find people who have the two skills, journalism and the law, particularly important in broadcasting, where you can be expected to talk about anything at very short notice. But there is the fact that newspapers find it harder to afford to pay full-time correspondents in a number of fields, and law is seen as a bit dull. It's not very glamorous. It's not very exciting. And so there are one or two newspapers, for example the Daily Telegraph, which don't feel they need a full-time legal correspondent.
So when you started your career, what was the best piece of advice that you received?
The best piece of advice I received was when doing a radio interview, not to say yes every time somebody said anything. That is the natural tendency in conversation. And the first thing you learn is don't say yes or that's right, because your voice in a broadcast interview is not likely to be heard. So the first interview I ever did for real wasn't used for that reason.
What would be something you're particularly proud of?
I can't think of any particular stories I'm proud of. There were one or two which, went on for a very long time and made a great impact. The first story I covered was the miners' strike of 1984-85. And that was the last time that the government was at risk of being brought down by a strike, and the last time that a strike was being fought through the courts in all sorts of very obscure and mysterious ways. And so there was intense interest in how the law would operate in that event. There were people called sequestrators who were trying to seize the assets of the National Union of Mine Workers. There was a man called the official solicitor, whose job it was to stop the miners' leader, Arthur Scargill, going to prison. And there were these curious areas of the law that were of great interest. And I was being tried out as a legal journalist at that time, and the BBC found that they needed somebody to do all this. And as soon as I was confirmed in my job, the miners' strike came to an end. So that was very significant. The trial of Rosemary West, the woman who was convicted of 10 murders in Gloucester, Cromwell Street, that was one particular case that I tried, that I covered from the beginning of the case to the very end. It was a harrowing case, but it was very, very interesting to watch it being tried. The case of Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator who fetched up in London and found himself facing extradition proceedings to Spain. That was fascinating because extradition combines law and politics. It did, particularly in those days before the law was changed. And that was a long-standing story which I covered and where I had some rather useful sources of information. And so the Chileans, who wanted to know whether their former dictator was coming home or not, were constantly asking me what was going on, and I was trying to find out and tell them. So, you know, there were these big cases that were fascinating in their own particular way.
You've obviously interviewed lots of prestigious lawyers and judges and politicians. Is there anyone left that you would actually love the opportunity to talk to, or have you got through all of them?
I've not spoken to the Lord Chancellor, Chris Grayling. We put in a request to interview him on Law in Action about legal aid a few months ago, and he said it was better handled by the legal aid minister, who was then Lord McNally. So I interviewed him instead. It would be nice to do an interview with the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, and who knows, perhaps the opportunity will come.
What is future projects for you? You're redoing Law in Action now. Is there anything in particular that you've always wanted to do that you might have the time to do now?
Broadcasting in the courts, I hope, will provide more opportunities. It hasn't really made much of an impact, and I suspect people thought it wouldn't, because appeals on the whole are not going to be of much interest. It would be nice to be able to do some live commentary on court cases to explain what's going on. I've done that a bit when the Supreme Court gives judgment, so you know, I'm explaining what's going on in court. I've done that for Sky News a few times. So those are opportunities to express law in different ways, but no, I think I'm very happy to wait and see what the next exciting case is, and just see what happens and how I can report it if I can.
Last question. You're married to Melanie Phillips, so does that make for interesting discussions or full-blown debates around the dinner table?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that. Melanie no longer works for the Daily Mail, but she's still a controversial columnist, as you say. I think we do both start from a slightly different perspective, but she has certainly persuaded me of some of her views, and I think, persuaded her of some of my views. But I can assure you that in terms of the world around us, we agree on very much more than we disagree.